fruitful deliberation. Whilst I hand over to Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you, Nana Brago. You would agree with me that yesterday started on a blistering note with the guest of honor, the minister's representatives, the moderators, presenters, panelists, and those who asked questions, as well as your active participation, were all at their best. So we're going to sustain that momentum from yesterday. Feel free to ask questions, contribute as and when a topic is raised or discussed. But before we start, we would like to call on the Most High God to be in our midst, to do us that honor or to lead us in prayer. We call on Mrs. Ernestina Pia. Could you please come up stage and lead us in opening prayer? Shall we receive her with a clap of hands? Okay, she could do it from where she is. Please.
Shall we bow down our heads in prayer? Our Most High God, this morning we are grateful unto you for yet another time like this. We commit our program this morning into your hands. We ask that you take your chair and be with us. We commit the presenters and everyone here into your hands. We pray that at the end of it, we'll be grateful that you've given us the strength, the wisdom to discuss all that we need to do. In Jesus' mighty name we have prayed with thanksgiving. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Hope your night was good. Right. We'd like to start this morning's program, and it's on taxation and illicit financial flows in the AfCFTA, challenges and solutions. As you can see on the high table, we have experts seated and ready to kickstart the day. To chair the program this morning, or this session this morning, is Ms. Mary Bine, Deputy Executive Secretary and Head, Member Services and Domestic Resources Mobilization of ATRN. Shall we give her a hand of applause? Could you please? Oh, let's do it better. Yes. I told you something yesterday. The higher the applause, the what? Yes. The presenter will be at her best, or the chairperson will be at her best. That's right. So, of course, the chairperson will introduce the presenter as well as the panelists for this morning's session. So I now hand you over to Mrs. Mary Bain to do the introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And I really want to start by wishing you all a very good morning, and also apologizing that we are starting slightly late because our online colleagues were not connecting and we had to sort that out. The technical team assures me that they are following, and I'm sure you agree that it's good that we all follow this together. So thank you so much for your patience. So this morning, like my colleague Joseph just said, under session 2, we are looking at taxation and illicit financial flows in the ACFTA, challenges and solutions. And the way we are going to run this session is that I will quickly ask the people on the table with me to introduce themselves, starting with Joy on my extreme left. And then I will give you a brief overview of the session, after which we'll have a presentation, a panel discussion that I will guide you through, and then we will open the floor so that you can interact with the different speakers, and then we'll conclude. So without further ado, I want to call on Joy so that we can also make good use of our time to introduce herself. Joy?
I will. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joy Warugurun Dubai. I am a doctoral candidate and a research associate at the Global Tax Policy Center at the Institute for Austrian International Tax Law in Vienna, and a great partner to ATF.
Mon nom est Médé Niquez, je suis professeur de droit et de sciences politiques à l'université d'Abomey-Calavi au Bénin. Et je suis aussi directeur du Centre d'études de recherche sur l'administration et les finances. Et récemment, depuis décembre, je suis président de la Société ouest-africaine de finances publiques. Merci.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rosemond Asante. I'm the head of components for trade facilitation in the Trade Facilitation West Africa program. So the Trade Facilitation West Africa program is a multi-donor funded program implemented by GIZ and the World Bank Group to improve the efficient implementation of trade facilitation measures, the efficient movement of goods along the corridors of West Africa, and also to reduce the cost of trade for small-scale cross-border traders, especially women. And I'm also responsible for the ECOWAS Fiscal Transition Program, which seeks to harmonize taxes in the community and also support the tax administrations to mobilize domestic revenue to support national development. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. That was not a rhetorical question. Sorry, my name is Alvin Musioma. I come from Kenya. I work for an organization called the Tax Justice Network Africa as the founding executive director. The Tax Justice Network Africa is a Pan-African platform of civil society organizations from across Africa that geared to support efforts towards domestic resource mobilization and ensuring that we have progressive and equitable tax system while at the same time addressing challenges that are related to the illicit financial flows phenomenon, which is the topic of our conversation this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, good people. It's good to see you here. It's good to have a lively group. My name is John Chagasikwa. I am from Zimbabwe. I, for the past 20 years, have been part of the Revenue Authority in Zimbabwe. And in terms of my exposure, I worked in both taxation and customs environments. And of course, I think over the years, had different portfolios, but I think what's important now is, I think the last, which I think most of you have gotten used to or just seen here, I was assisting the Commissioner General for the Revenue Authority until about 5 days ago. And so I am independent, as it were. Besides being part of ZIMRA, I have been one of the ATRN advisory board members. And also, I think this is the time to indicate I'm one of the outgoing board members advisory board members for ATRN. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I think it's good now that we know each other and we know who will be speaking. I'd like to introduce the session by saying that Yesterday, we largely looked at the impact of the AfCFTA on customs and trade taxes, and today we will look at the implications of this increased trade and what this will mean for taxation on the continent. Several speakers yesterday alluded to the FTA being misused or exploited, leading to possible illicit financial flows. And today, we will be looking at that, in a deeper way. And I want to say that due to the wide coverage of the rules of the free trade agreements and international investment agreements, overlaps with domestic tax measures and tax agreements of countries have frequently arisen to a level that is really lengthy and often leads to disputes. And these disputes, like we all know, are expensive. And these can take quite a bit of time. And these usually don't benefit anybody. And so today, we will be looking at some of that. So where breaches of the various trade and investment provisions are found by the respective dispute panels, they can result in limitations to the ability of a country to reform or enhance their tax regime. And the management of these overlaps have become a central concern. But luckily, because we're coming in later, we'll be able to hear, when Joy presents and from the speakers, some of the experiences from some of these regions and how best we can learn from those errors, from those challenges, and be able to devise solutions right up front so that the AfCFTA is successful and we don't lose the revenue that we really need for the development of our continent. So this is of particular importance to the implementation of regional agreements, particularly the AfCFTA, which contains both trade obligations and investor protection. So while protecting investors, are we providing incentives that are harmful? And once that happens, how does it play in terms of fairness? And how do countries then address whatever disputes arise from that? So state parties to the AfCFTA need to understand the ways in which the impact on taxation may vary from provision to another and may face interpretational conflicts in one dispute forum compared to another. So whilst the importance of regional cooperation to combat illicit financial flows has been emphasized by multiple institutions and calls to action, the AfCFTA should be used as an opportunity to establish harmonized and joint approaches. And so the discussants will look at this harmonization. Is it relevant? Is it critical for the formation of the AfCFTA and its success? And so today, that is what we'll be looking at, and we will be looking at the different obligations of the countries, how those will be addressed, how the tax component will be affected, and what mitigating factors we can learn, because we saw that as there is an expected loss, there could be efficiency gains if we structure our tax policy and our operations right. And with that short introduction, I'd like to welcome our presenter of the day, our very own Joy in Dubai. So Joy, over to you.
Great. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Good morning again, everyone. As I mentioned, I'm from the Global Tax Policy Center in Vienna, and our research center has had the pleasure of partnering with ATAF over the last year to actually scope out these issues. And we've been able to evaluate the way in which the AfCFTA will interact with taxation and IFF policies and measures. So today I'll actually try to summarize the culmination of months of research, analysis, debate, to actually just as simply as possible explain to you why this interaction is important and why we as tax experts now need to take steps to collaborate with our trade and investment colleagues to jointly support the financial integrity of the future single market. So my presentation this morning, as you can see, I have an overview here, will provide a summary of the key overlaps of between taxation and trade, taxation and international investment agreements, which I will refer to as IIAs, and the interaction between illicit financial flows, or IFFs, and trade. I will provide a short analysis of the expected implications for the AfCFTA, some of the considerations for DRM, and finally, I'll give you some key recommendations, including some immediate steps that we as tax people can begin to take in the short term. So just to begin, the framework for multilateral trade, international investment agreements, IIAs, and international taxation have developed in parallel. And although they have been governed by different rules and principles, the scope of these rules and principles do often overlap. And because of the wide coverage of the rules of free trade agreements and investment agreements, overlaps with domestic tax measures and tax agreements often arise. Now, these overlaps can actually give rise to breaches of the trade obligations or the investment obligations that we have, and this can result, as Mary has mentioned, in very expensive and lengthy disputes for countries, arising either in the trade framework, so between two countries, or in the investment arbitration space, and that can be between an investor and a country, and we refer to this as investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS for short. There are going to be a lot of abbreviations, so Mary, please stop me if my abbreviations are too many. So where a breach of trade or investment provisions is found by the respective dispute or arbitration panel, it can introduce notable constraints for taxation measures. So actually what can happen is that you might be required to modify or eliminate or provide financial compensation for introducing a specific tax measure. And that has important consequences for tax policy making in the future. The UN Tax Committee have actually
Sorry,
just,
Joy,
yes.
can you move a little slower? The interpreters are struggling.
Okay. Okay. I'm trying my best. My mind is moving a bit ahead. Okay, so the UN Tax Committee have begun to evaluate this issue, and just this year, they established the subcommittee on the interaction between trade, investment, and taxation. And this is of great interest at the global level, but also at the regional level. So what they have tried to do is identify when and whether a tax measure breaches the provisions of an FTA, a free trade agreement, or an IIA. And it's dependent on a number of key aspects that they have identified. So first, the type of the tax measure involved. The most frequent measures that we've seen being challenged in the trade context are actually tax incentives. That's a very important thing to consider. They've been challenged as subsidies in the context of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, whilst in the IIA context, the concern has been the withdrawal of tax incentives and the imposition of tax measures. And I'll take you through a few cases just to give you an idea of the expenses involved. The second issue is the nature of the obligations entered into in the various IIAs, investment agreements, or the FTAs, and often it's important to remember, as with the CFTA, that regional trade agreements contain investment chapters, and these also introduce investor protections. So I will also refer to investment chapters, which is broadly the investment protocols in a regional trade agreement. So, these kinds of provisions have been used, or some might say misused, by investors to exercise their rights and constrain the types of tax measures that countries may take. The third issue is the extent of tax carve-outs, and I will explain this. Carve-outs are provisions that provide either specific or general exceptions for selected tax measures, and they effectively try to limit the application of a provision. So what they'll try to do is guide the panel and say, you can only interpret to this extent. Finally, the dispute settlement mechanism. And this is a very important point because at the cross-border level, taxation is facing a bit of a crisis when it comes to dispute settlement. It's extremely important because we as African countries have rejected arbitration, but access to arbitration is still available through the investment treaty framework, so the IIA framework. So just to briefly remind you, what we've tried to do is evaluate other regional frameworks. Of course, the WTO framework is one of the most important and the most immediate examples that we have. So what I've done is set a bit of a reminder about the establishing agreement, the number of members, the number of African members in specific. We have 48 members, 6 observers, 1 non-member, and the agreements that I will focus on today, because we have quite a few agreements within the WTO framework: the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, the GATT, the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, the SCM Agreement, the General Agreement on Trade in Services, GATS, and the Dispute Settlement Understanding, the DSU. A lot of abbreviations, I apologize, but I will remind you consistently. So kicking off with the implications of GATT. So GATT seeks to eliminate the barriers to cross-border trade in goods. It provides for the tariff concessions, which we've discussed extensively from a CFTA context, and it stipulates that rules that seek to ensure that internal taxes and other internal regulations which affect imported and domestic products do not discriminate against international trade. So just to clarify, we're very interested in the non-discrimination principles. What are the non-discrimination principles, which are of very important interest to us? The Most Favored Nation Obligation, or MFN, which prohibits discrimination between like goods of different origin. So, country A may not grant more favorable treatment to televisions from country B than it does to televisions from country C, right? And members should provide equality of competitive opportunities for like imported products. Then we have the National Treatment Obligation, the NT. Refer to it as NT, but I'll remind you, national treatment. It requires no less favorable treatment than domestic products, and the main purpose is to prevent the use of internal measures in such a way that affords protection to domestic products. So we have MFN, NT, and these are the formulation of the non-discrimination principles, as I will refer to them. So what are the implications for tax measures that have arisen in the last few years? Since the non-discrimination principles make reference to internal taxes and internal regulations, they can actually have an impact on indirect and direct taxes. So I'm moving us beyond the discussion on tariffs to understand what to expect for tax policymaking beyond, right? So these two principles actually have a very wide scope of application, and it can result in tax measures or tax treaties being found to be inconsistent with the two obligations. And there are no exceptions. There are no carve-outs to these provisions. So it means there is a possibility to challenge national tax decisions at the WTO dispute settlement body, the WTO DSB, although there's a general understanding that tax treaty provisions are acceptable. So we focus on direct tax measures only, mainly. There's one important example I've tried to put together, and you can see down there the Brazil taxation 2019 case. And in this case, it involved a complaint raised by the European Union concerning specific taxation measures and charges enjoyed by members of Mercosur, so that's their regional trade area, and domestic producers in Brazil. So these measures actually provided exemptions, reductions, suspensions of federal taxes and contributions, and they were found to be inconsistent with the non-discrimination principles in GATT, as well as other provisions, and Brazil was required to withdraw these provisions within 90 days. So remember at the beginning I said, you will be required to withdraw some of these tax policy measures if they are inconsistent or incompatible with the requirements of a trade trade law, or the CFTA in this context. This brings us very nicely into the discussion on subsidies and tax incentives broadly. So Article 14 of GATT and the SEM agreement provide the framework of the WTO rules on subsidies. So although subsidies are commonly used and they do have legitimate objectives, they can actually have adverse effects on the interests of other WTO members whose industries may suffer from unfair competition because of the subsidies for their products on domestic or export markets. So members are actually required to notify the WTO about any subsidies they adopt. But one of the reasons the WTO is in crisis, as some may call it, is the lack of notification that has been going on. So as the CFTA Secretariat move forward their work, this will be a very important point, is notifications about the incentives being adopted by countries, and there must be a willingness to be transparent about these incentives. So what is the definition of subsidies? I'll focus on the tax aspects of it because it's rather broad, and it's defined as a financial contribution by a government or any public body within the territory of a member where government revenue that is otherwise due or foregone or not collected, for example, fiscal incentives such as tax credits, and that's a direct quote from the provision, and a benefit is conferred. So there are two types of subsidies, but today we're focusing on prohibited subsidies, which is where the tax matters fall. And these are those that are conditional or dependent upon export performance or the use of domestic over imported goods. So Annex 1 of the SCM agreement actually provides an illustrative list. And this list includes exemptions or deferrals of direct taxes or social welfare charges and special deductions in calculating the tax base. So even the capital allowances that you're permitting in your countries can be challenged as subsidies, meaning that you must notify the WTO and maybe in the future the CFTA Secretariat. So there are important implications for tax measures. If a prohibited subsidy is found, a country can be permitted to issue countermeasures, and these are financial, and they can be very expensive. So this means that the use of national tax incentives can be challenged in a trade forum. So one of the most famous examples as a case is the US Foreign Sales Corporation case, the FSC case. And it concerned a complaint raised by the European Union. You can tell the European Union is very active about special tax treatment offered to these FSCs. These were found to be prohibited, and since they were not immediately withdrawn, countermeasures were approved. What was the result? The EU issued an ad valorem charge of 100% on imports of specific goods from the US, amounting to $443 million per year, and that was granted in 2003 and withdrawn in 2006. So there are great financial implications we must begin to be aware of. That shifts me into the GATS, or the trade in services. So GATS also raises similar concerns, and again, we're concerned with the non-discrimination principles. It concerns measures affecting trades in services, but may have limited scope when it comes to national treatment, because it only applies to the extent a member commits to grant national treatment to a specific sector. So you must check if they've granted national treatment to this sector. For MFN, you may exempt some measures, and it affects like services and service suppliers and holds the standard of treatment no less favorable. Of course, again of note, NT and MFN, but they do have caveats in this context. So here, the tax people were invited to the conversation. And these are contained in the general exceptions provisions, and you'll learn a little later in this session that the CFTA have taken on the same treatment. This caveat has actually proven insufficient, unfortunately. And one of the most interesting and I think important cases, it's the Argentina Financial Services, which concerned claims raised by Panama regarding defensive tax measures that were introduced by Argentina as sanctions in response to the OECD blacklisting. Right? So when countries were blacklisted for being non-cooperative with the requirement to exchange tax information, the result was some countries want to impose sanctions, but do you have the right to impose these sanctions, or do you have the right to introduce a defensive tax measure that looks like a sanction? This, of course, affected Panama, because we know Panama's status in the blacklisting processes, and the appellate body actually found this distinction between cooperative and non-cooperative jurisdictions wasn't just based on origin. So it wasn't just a question of discrimination on the basis of origin. So whilst they agreed in favor of Argentina, there are pending issues still to be determined, which means that defensive tax measures can be challenged in a trade forum. And when I say defensive tax measures, it moves beyond what they try to do with the sanctions against Panama. It could be anti-avoidance measures. It could be the general, it could be the specific. It could move towards the global minimum tax that we've been widely discussing as well, and it's a great concern. So why is this important? Tax caveats are not working, and we've seen that. Disputes are expensive. They have expensive implications for countries, and dialogue is necessary. And this is an opportunity to kick off that dialogue. I'll quickly explain to you the position of IIAs and then move on to the CFTA situation. So IIAs include bilateral investment treaties, or BITs, multilateral investment agreements, and the investment chapters in FTAs. BITs are the most common. They broadly contain similar provisions, but the idea is to provide investors with protections that they can exercise against the host country. So it's protecting the investor and their investment. Why is this important? UNCTAD have done really excellent work trying to evaluate the common provisions that have been used or misused by investors in the context of tax-related measures. Now, IIAs impose obligations on states that can actually create frictions with tax measures, the actions of tax authorities, and even tax policy making, broadly speaking. And it can actually engage international responsibility of a country under an IIA, which will then result in limitation of your national tax sovereignty. So the last 20 years has actually seen a huge increase in the number of ISDS cases. As of 2021, 165 cases so far, wide-ranging issues, special economic zones, VAT, customs, the withdrawal of tax incentives, the acceptability of tax incentives. And so it's very important to pay attention to the developments in this space because they result in constraints in the tax space. Some of the most common provisions, as you can see on my list here, I'll focus on 3 of them, just to take us a bit faster. Fair and equitable treatment is actually the most frequently invoked provision, and it requires that states provide regulatory stability and the legitimate expectations of the investor are met. Because old IIAs have been broad, there's been broad interpretation and therefore broad application of this concept, and it has frequently been applied to tax measures. And shortly, I will show you the expenses involved in the claims of FET, or FET as we refer to it. FPS, or full protection and security, has similar implications, very broad. It's about states not harming investors or their investments through acts attributable to the state. Finally, we have expropriation. It's about the dispossession of an investment. And what has happened is indirect expropriation has been claimed by a lot of investors since they are indirectly dispossessing of an investment through taxation. So what is the impact? Again, I mentioned at the beginning that our cross-border tax dispute settlement is a little bit in crisis. So investors are gradually shifting to this BIT system in order to challenge the actions of countries. And as I said, it's very expensive, carve-outs are not enough, broad interpretation has continued, and we have a number of cases that have arisen. As you can see, some of the most well-known cases actually, UCOS concerned indirect expropriation, $50 billion plus interest was the final award. Vodafone versus India, which has been ongoing actually, and it remains a challenge, $5.47 million, but interest to be determined because it's still ongoing. This last case with Romania, which is Mercula v. Romania, actually a very interesting case. So $116 million, but it involves 2 issues. A conflict between state aid obligations in the EU, because Romania was joining the European Union at this time and had to withdraw their incentives in order to comply with state aid obligations, which is effectively the subsidies requirement. So this is important to keep in mind. The withdrawal of a subsidy has the potential to violate the protections for an investor in a bilateral investment treaty. And this came into conflict, and they're still in conflict. EU says, if you pay the award that has been granted, we will consider it state aid, and we will fine you. So you will also have to pay us, right? So there's been no solution so far, but a very interesting case to follow. Finally, the treatment of illicit financial flows. What I've tried to do is provide the lessons and the risks that we are facing, and I think our colleagues from ECOWAS might be here, but they're great lessons to learn from ECOWAS. So in the ECOWAS framework, heads of states of the member countries established GIABA, the Intergovernmental Action Group Against Money Laundering in West Africa, and this has assisted countries in strengthening capacity to combat money laundering and terrorist financing, as well as implementing the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. One of the great quotes I saw from one of the annual reports, regional coordination is geared towards ensuring that criminals who commit financial crimes in one member state cannot hide in another. And that's so important to the trust building but also to the integrity of this future single market. Within the European Union, I'm sure you've all heard of the anti-money laundering directives, which first introduced in 1991. And the whole purpose was a recognition that credit and financial institutions were being used to launder the proceeds of crime. And this was jeopardizing the soundness and stability of the institutions and the confidence in the financial system of the single market. One of the points made by the community at that time was that, and it's important to note, of course, lack of community action against money laundering can lead member states, for the purpose of protecting their financial systems, to adopt measures which could be inconsistent with completion of the single market. So unilateral measures are not ideal. In a context where you are establishing a single market, you need joint action. And just indeed, they said, in order to facilitate their criminal activities, launderers could try to take advantage of the freedom of capital movement, freedom to supply financial services within this financial single market, and it requires coordination of measures to prevent the risk of doing so. Unilateral measures will only result in people taking advantage of the lack of harmonization. So it's time to think about the harmonization efforts that need to take place. Ultimately, combating IFFs can only be done through coordination. It can only be effective through coordination. However, for the financial integrity, it's even more important that a legal framework for that coordination will be established at the AU level. So just to give you an idea of the risks that we face if we do not come together to harmonize and if we follow the unilateral approach. As you can tell, the WTO is not really it's not a fully integrated system like the European Union, but they have cases where IFF policy measures have been challenged. So the Colombia measures relating to the importation of textiles, apparel, and footwear actually concerned, again, Panama. They're well known for taking up cases in the WTO. And they claim that Colombia were in violation of the MFN principle because the measure they introduced, as they said, had been designed to combat illegal trade operations not covered by MFN, because Panama's reported exports of the goods concerned were threefold compared to Colombia's imports from Panama, indicating under-invoicing and smuggling. A good point to take here is data is very important, and data sharing between countries will tell you if there are incidences of under-invoicing or smuggling. Now, what happened here, they were of the view that some of these goods were being undervalued for purposes of money laundering. Unfortunately, the panel did not agree, and they actually stated that undervaluation was not necessarily an indication of money laundering. And this is directly in contradiction of the work being done at FATF. So FATF actually say that predicate offenses to money laundering should be recognized widespread amongst countries. And they recognize some of these predicate offenses to include smuggling, tax crimes, counterfeit goods, and more. Unfortunately, Colombia were found in violation of MFN, and they had to withdraw this tariff, even if it was serving a purpose, right? It was not just raising revenue, it was stopping the under-invoicing and smuggling that was taking place. So this demonstrates a potential for conflict between trade obligations and the need to effectively design tools or measures that combat money laundering and other financial crimes. And you must remember, we're in a dynamic environment. Things are changing. We need to respond very fast. And if trade obligations are holding us back from those responses, then there are conflicts in the system, and there's a loophole for criminals to be able to do what they usually do. So what are the implications for DRM, and why are we taking this conversation beyond the tariff revenue discussion that we had yesterday? So we should not only be concerned with tariff revenue, because that's just part of the story. And in fact, it's maybe the most straightforward aspect of the way in which tax revenue will be impacted. Constraints on fiscal resources resulting from trade and investment obligations are much more complex and nuanced. They're more than just this loss of tariff revenue. So a crucial step now is to understand the impact on tax policy making. What do the new obligations mean for the way in which we develop and implement
tax policies in the future. In particular, countries will need to navigate this additional control on fiscal sovereignty, and it must be viewed as such. We have to have regard for the obligations we have entered into, so we must develop policies in regard with these obligations. We must pursue cooperation, and we need to avoid the potential for disputes, right? So there are lessons to be learned from other frameworks. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is a great example of this. They have innovated around the need to protect their revenue and the need to generate revenue effectively. And they're great examples from the treatment of investor protections in this case. So I've tried my best to summarize some of the problems that we've identified, and I'll try and quickly just take you through some of these issues. I think Mary already pointed out the problem of tax competition now needs to be addressed urgently. Whilst we have tariff revenue losses as a challenge, the actual problem will be strengthening the sources of DRM, and that will be the smaller countries that are still reliant on on tariffs, will need to be able to have a system and an environment that enables them to steadily, with the capacity that's required, build up their DRM. Why am I emphasizing this point about the environment? Tax competition can frustrate the strengthening of DRM. And if we truly view ourselves as a future community, then we must come together and harmonize our stance on tax competition to help protect these new tax bases that are emerging in our sister and brother countries. So it's very important. So other aspects of taxation will also be affected beyond tariff revenue. The elimination of borders actually affects the operation of value-added taxes in the future. Yesterday, the Commissioner General of the GRA aptly pointed out the challenge of VAT fraud in the European Union. We should not play the wait and see, especially because VAT has emerged as a crucial source of revenue for a lot of countries. Cooperation between countries needs to address the future issues and the systems, the processes, the capacity required to curb it. So ATAF, you have a lot of work. So the CFTA includes tax incentives as potential non-tariff barriers. The stance on subsidies is broadly relaxed, but we are waiting to see. So this NTB status could mean that incentives will need to be reviewed by the CFTA Secretariat. Again, ATAF and CFTA will now need to come together to create guidance and issue it to countries to understand how to develop and design their tax incentives in the future. Both the Protocol on Trade in Services and the Protocol on Trade in Goods take the same approach as the WTO. So the same issues I've identified apply in this context. For trade in services, the carve-outs are not sufficient. Defensive tax measures may be at risk. For trade in goods, there are no carve-outs. Tax measures can be challenged as discriminatory. It means that countries are vulnerable to the potential for disputes, and this is why cooperation is more important than ever. The illicit financial flows, of course. There's no reference to IFFs for cooperation and the need for cooperation in the agreement, unfortunately. And this would have been an opportunity to actually establish the combating of IFFs as a base requirement for countries to be able to engage each other through the CFTA. There's a need for continental effort to benchmark and assess the preparedness of national regulatory frameworks and practices to harmonize. Of course, IFFs can be a barrier to implementation, and we've learned this from the EU context. It threatens the integrity of the financial market, which is the center of our single market and our future customs union. Disputes concerning IFFs remain a possibility, and so we need harmonization. We need to advance with harmonization in order to avoid these challenges in the future. What immediate steps can be taken? And I view this as a short-term, medium-term, and long-term approach, because these issues are consistently emerging. But you must remember, we are not in the same world that the European Union was when they began their process. Things are moving, this is a dynamic environment, and we must be able to respond effectively. So, in the short term, the staged approach: analyze and address the tax consequences. First, the tariff and the broader DRM matters should be dealt with. Next, we must prepare the dispute panels to engage with or include tax experts. We need to know what are the immediate tax issues that will arise, where do we need to cooperate. Next, the evaluation of the investment protocol to review the treatment of taxation. More immediately, clarity on the treatment of tax incentives through the non-tariff barriers or the subsidies processes, and the need for the harmonized approach to tax competition. Finally, ATF. South-South capacity and skills exchange will be necessary. Benchmarking to identify best practices in customs administration, strengthening DRM, and so on will help to build the contextual solutions. For IFFs, we need to introduce the combating of IFFs as a central objective of the AfCFTA, follow the ECOWAS examples, follow the EU examples, minimize the likelihood of disputes through cooperation, through harmonization, through establishing a strong AU framework that helps us to harmonize our processes. Broadly speaking, I've tried to highlight here all of the points I've made today into very simplified points so we can discuss it with the panel. I hope I've provided a simplified version of this very complex story. And I hope it can open up more dialogue between ourselves and the investment and trade communities. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy, and thank you so much, participants, for applauding Joy, because she's really done, the subject justice. And I'm sure you've taken note of all those areas where you require some clarity or where you'd like to ask questions. So I'll seek your indulgence. Please just note that down, and there will be an opportunity for you to address any questions to Joy during the Q&A. But at this point, I'd like to go to my very able panelists. But before that, I got about 4 key takeaways from what Joy said. The first being the loss of tariff revenue is not the only concern for countries. So there's still a lot more to be looked at. Yesterday, we were only looking at just, the tip of the iceberg. Today, we're looking at the deeper issues that trade will actually unveil. So you will keep that in mind as we go into the discussion. The second is that there's a need to understand the impact of the trade provisions and the investment protocol of the AfCFTA. And this will help us to avoid possible challenges of national decisions. So if joining the AfCFTA is a sovereign decision, but operating within the AfCFTA brings obligations that need every country to understand what that is. The third is dispute management. This is likely to rise, as she said, and she gave various examples. I like that you gave, lots of examples to show that initially this was really an agreement that everybody went into, for instance, in the EU, but as they went on, because every country was trying to maximize gains, there were disputes, and how will those be raised? So to prevent the potential overlaps, there will be a need to include expertise. So I think as we work towards joining and operationalizing the AfCFTA, if I had Joy right, then we need to have a whole of government approach. We shouldn't only have, say, the customs people look at the AfCFTA. No, it will affect the entire government, the entire tax policy, the entire trade and, investment policies. And then lastly, she talked about the need for cooperation to combat illicit financial flows, especially at a regional level. I liked that because it means there will be more sharing of information. Everybody will be looking at the good of his or her neighbor, and that way we will be able to protect all these revenues. But that said, I'd like to hear from our panelists. I'm sure they also did get their takeaways from Joy, and they'll be sharing this, and I'll be asking some questions. So the way we run the panel is slightly different. I will ask, there'll be one discussant for every question, and then the other panel members can also give a comment so that we keep it as interactive as possible. And my first question will be on domestic resource mobilization and the AfCFTA. And the main discussant here will be Professor Nikez Mehdi, who is the director of the Center of Studies and Research of Administration and Finance in Benin. And he will be speaking in French, so for those of you who are not as fortunate as me to be bilingual, you will need your headsets. And I want to say, Professor, that the loss of tax revenue, like we've just heard from Joy, is not only a concern for countries that have been seeking to strengthen their domestic revenue mobilization efforts. The mobilization of fiscal revenue not only needs to address the fiscal impact of the trade and investment obligations of the AfCFTA, but it also needs to determine future fiscal decisions like Joy labored to explain. And of course, to address tax competition between countries and ensure cooperation for fiscal integrity. Professor Medi, how can countries continue to exercise fiscal sovereignty in this dynamic environment? Because she explained that while it's a fiscal decision, it has impacts at a global and regional level that have to be looked at. And then secondly, how would this affect national commitments to the CFTA? What considerations need to be made on taxation? And finally, is there a need for coordination between countries on this aspect to prevent disputes? Professor Medi will be our main discussant, and then I will ask the panelists to also give their views on this. Over to you, Professor Medi. Sorry, Professor, before you start.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Okay, sorry.
Alors, la question de la mobilisation des ressources intérieures, je vais l'aborder sous l'angle déjà examiné par Madame Joy, à savoir réaliser les conditions d'une concurrence parfaite. Alors, les conditions d'une concurrence parfaite, elle a décrit ça assez brièvement, c'est d'éviter les subventions qui faussent la concurrence entre les entreprises, entre les États. Et je n'apporte pas de solution en réalité, hein, c'est une contribution au débat. Ce que je remarque, c'est que l'ensemble de nos pays, nous avons été invités de manière assez insistante à transformer nos produits primaires. Donc, à industrialiser nos États. À transformer le cacao, à transformer le coton en textile, à transformer, etc., etc. Et donc, de ne plus exporter uniquement des matières premières et en espérant recevoir des ressources suffisantes pour financer les besoins des budgets nationaux, mais transformer localement nos produits. Alors, la transformation, le besoin de transformation, l'idée de transformation, les politiques de transformation ont conduit ces mêmes États à mettre l'accent sur la création de zones industrielles spéciales. La zone industrielle spéciale, c'est une zone industrielle sur le territoire duquel les entreprises qui s'implantent bénéficient d'avantages fiscaux, spécialement. Je me souviens, le gouvernement du Bénin, à travers son chef, était en visite à Paris la semaine dernière et le représentant du Bénin a promis aux entrepreneurs français que s'ils viennent au Bénin investir, créer des entreprises, des industries notamment, ils vont payer le courant qui leur sera facturé sera au 6e du prix. C'est-à-dire que nous aurons un courant vendu à Cotonou aussi moins cher qu'en Chine. C'est l'expression qui a été employée. Et courant vendu aussi moins cher qu'en Chine, ça veut dire que d'une manière ou d'une autre, l'État subventionne le coût. Les nationaux paieront le courant à un certain prix, mais l'investisseur étranger qui s'installe dans la zone industrielle paiera un prix différencié parce que l'État sera intervenu d'une manière ou d'une autre, notamment par la fiscalité, pour baisser le prix du courant. Alors, va s'installer évidemment, pour ces entreprises qui s'installent en zone industrielle, une sorte de différence entre ces entreprises-là, qui sont en zone industrielle spéciale, et les autres entreprises qui ne sont pas en zone industrielle, et surtout les entreprises des pays voisins qui ne bénéficient pas des mêmes avantages fiscaux. Alors, le problème va se poser d'une manière ou d'une autre comme ça. Et la question de la concurrence parfaite va se poser également de cette manière-là. Comment gérer avec nos coûts des investissements, puisque c'est encore une autre dimension de la chose, avec nos coûts des investissements qui accordent des avantages à la fois sur les impôts directs, mais également sur certains droits d'établissement en termes d'importation de biens d'équipement. Comment harmoniser toutes ces politiques fiscales incitatives avec les conditions d'une concurrence parfaite telle qu'elle a été décrite par Madame Joy tout à l'heure. Donc, le fond du problème est là. Et le contexte que nous vivons, où on nous dit qu'il est inconcevable que nos pays, par exemple le Bénin, produisent près de 600 000 tonnes, 700 000 tonnes cette année de coton, et nous importons le textile, c'est-à-dire les habits, les culottes, les slips et tout ce que vous voulez, la lingerie féminine, que cela est logiquement inadmissible. Et qu'avec ce coton transformé, nous allons non seulement approvisionner le marché local, mais également exporter vers des destinations lointaines, notamment avec la Goa vers les États-Unis. Donc, l'idée fondamentale est là, industrialiser, mais qui dit industrialisation dit d'une manière ou d'une autre incitation des entreprises étrangères à venir s'installer. Et les zones économiques spéciales, les zones industrielles spéciales, un peu après Théma, il y a une zone industrielle spéciale qui est en voie de construction ou qui existe déjà. Celle du Bénin est en chantier au nord de la ville d'Abomey-Calavi, etc., etc. Le Togo a déjà sa zone franche industrielle. L'ensemble des pays, donc, s'emploient à créer ces zones industrielles spéciales. Et le moteur de ces zones industrielles, c'est évidemment l'impôt.
I saw an SEC that in Benin we have. So is that many.
La problématique qui est posée, c'est comment, avec ces zones industrielles évidemment, avec les subventions qui vont avec, comment réussir une concurrence parfaite pour que les accords de libre-échange puissent avoir un sens. Je crois que moi, je n'ai pas la solution évidemment, mais la question se pose et comme ce n'est pas nouveau.
Since this is not a new debate because we are within the ECOWAS, we have observed similar issues. And we can use the examples of this REC, for example, to chart our path with the AfCFTA agreement. Another question that was raised, I don't think that our within WIMO, for example, there is an external common external tariff products, and some countries do provide notification to the REC, but they do otherwise on their territories. And one thing that we have observed is that sanctions seem to be ineffective. Sometimes it's very difficult to impose sanctions on states because and within in the case of cooperation, for example, within WIMO, we realize that member states, but they are not really affected by these sanctions. Mostly, we tell them, if you continue behaving in this way, yet we are really unable to impose effective sanctions on them.
fiscale pour faire face, notamment aux incitations aux entreprises étrangères à venir s'installer. Cette concurrence.
So when it comes to perfect competition, we have to really focus on this and find perfect competition upgrade into a wall. So these are some of the answers I have on coordination, fiscal sovereignty, fiscal cooperation, and perfect competition.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I think you largely agreed with what Joy was saying, especially regarding the fact that because countries will be diversifying and trying to industrialize more to benefit from intra-African trade, they will be issuing incentives that could then pose a problem on the global arena. I would like to say that you also did, it was good that you gave examples, especially of what is happening in the western part of the continent and some of the challenges that have been met, especially in operationalizing the customs union. And you agree that indeed there will be elements that need to be looked at, especially in terms of how this directly affects the tax policy in the different countries. And I would now like to call upon the other panelists so that we can hear your views on these three areas that Professor Mehdi has spoken to, and also in relation to what Joy said in her presentation. I'll start with you, Rosamond.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mary. And thank you to Joy and Professor for the brilliant presentations. And just to add that, as reiterated by Joy in her presentation, once we commit ourselves to international protocols, it also behoves on us that we need to abide by the tenets of the protocols. And if you look at the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, it actually comprises, you have the rights and obligations of private sector actors, as well as customs administrations. So once we append our signatures or we commit to it, it means that we have committed to the tenets of the agreement. And therefore, we need to make sure that we abide by them, and then we try not to breach our investment laws, our incentives laws, to see if there are any contradictory provisions in those laws, and as much as possible, we try to revise them. Because once it's a national law, we can always revise them through using our own processes. Another issue raised was dispute resolution. And I think this is very key and critical. Because as of now, at least most of us here from the ECOWAS region, you will agree with me that we have an issue along the Abidjan-Lagos corridor that has dragged for some time and is highly political. So then the question is, within ECOWAS, I am yet to find out anyway, do we have very clear dispute resolution mechanisms? Because if we do, then perhaps there's an opportunity to roll out whatever we have in the mechanism. Because this issue is highly political and has dragged for some time, to the extent that goods from Ghana cannot cross Benin to Nigeria, and goods from Nigeria cannot cross Benin to the other member states. And this is affecting the ECOWAS trade liberalization scheme. So it's good to know that AfCFTA, they have made adequate provision in terms of dispute resolution. Now the challenge will be with implementation. We need to make sure that it's not just a paper or a document that has been agreed by the various state parties, but then there are measures to actually implement the dispute resolution mechanism. And I'm talking about CET. I think Professor mentioned that some of the member states are not really complying with the CET provisions. Agreed. But within the CET, that is the ECOWAS Common External Tariff. So within the ECOWAS Common External Tariff, which was rolled out in January 2015, it was agreed by the heads of states that in view of the different sizes of the economies and in terms of their development and economic activities, it is important that they implement what they call the supplementary protection measures for a period of 5 years. That is up to December 2019. So at the end of December 2019, there was a study, there was an evaluation that went around the member states to see the level of compliance. And it came out that out of the 15, we have 14 of our member states implementing the CET. And out of the 14, 5 of them are not using the supplementary protection measures. So it means that they are following the rules and procedures within the CET. But then of the remaining 9, I mean, it's allowed, the supplementary protection measures was allowed up to 2019. So at the end of 2019, the heads of states, upon the findings of the study, we realized that our member states were still not ready to fully implement the CET. So it was agreed to also extend it for another 3 years, which is December 2020, to assess I think the heads of states would decide whether there's a need for another extension, or maybe we need to look at the whole CET concept again. So this is just to emphasize that we can have all these nice in the systems, and we don't assess our capacities to really implement these agreements. We do always have an issue when it comes to implementation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosemond. And in addition to responding or to reacting to what Professor Medi said, she also did make her own intervention. But I would like to say that I like that you raised the issue of the sanctions, because Professor Medi also mentioned those. The fact that the sanctions that are in place in some of the regional communities are not a deterrent. But under the WTO, from what Joy said, that is definitely going to be a different ball game. So how are countries preparing for this? And Alvin, in your response, if you can then also talk to that issue, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary, and really great presentation by Joy, and she has given us a lot of food for thought. I don't know if I'll be able to I'll be making my submissions later on, but allow me to make just three remarks. One, I think the point I picked first from Professor's submission is that when we talk about tax incentives, it's important to distinguish. There's a reason we say harmful tax incentives, because not necessarily all tax incentives are bad. And particularly in the context of Africa's efforts for industrialization, it's important to underscore that ultimately, at the end of it all, a successful CFTA will be one that recognizes Africa's industrialization agenda in the context of Agenda 2063. And so if you have provisions both in the CFTA that undermines this effort by limiting states' ability to use tax as a tool to direct investments, particularly in support of a nascent economy, and particularly trying to support small and medium-scale enterprises, then what might result to happen is, yes, we will have a CFTA, but a CFTA that is not supporting Africa's industrialization agenda, where we are having a free market, but a free market of foreign goods and not goods that are produced in the continent. I think that's really a very important point to underscore, particularly the important role that tax in this regard can be used as a tool to ensure that governments are supporting specific sectors, and Professor gave the example of the textile industry. In other countries we have seen in Kenya, the tourism, the flower sector, and other asset sectors that provides really opportunities for the continent to support this industrialization agenda. That's, I think, the first point I would like to state in reaction to Professor's point. Then the point from Rosalind's and Joy's presentation, I think there will be need to unpack a little bit more this contestation between the WTO framing and the CFTA, because what we also don't want to have is WTO smuggled into the AfCFTA, also WTO 2.0, which is really what the CFTA should not be about. And what do I mean with this? It is important to underscore that there are particular provisions in the WTO that are contested. So when we are citing WTO says this, WTO says that, it's really important to recognize that some of these provisions have been contested by many of African countries when you talk of most favored nation, the national treatment. These are all provisions that many of our government have fought back because they believe that they're actually pulling away the rug from our feet in terms of what countries need to do to support their own economic development. So we should, I think, Joey, that would be my very first feedback to you in terms of the research that you're working. How do we take a more critical view in terms of ensuring that really the CFTA's agenda is aligned to the continental industrialization agenda? And it's no surprise, I think, for me, one thing that kind of my eyes popped up when, Joy, you were speaking, is that the CFTA does not make any reference to the question of illicit financial flows and capital flight. That's shocking, particularly when you consider that these two issues are under one AU department, the ATM department, the Economic Development, Trade, and Mining. That, I think, gives us food for thought on the question you raised about how these issues overlap, but the processes are parallel. The issues of trade, investment, they overlap in the reality and in the real life, but in terms of the processes that contribute to the formulation of the policy frameworks in the investment and trade and tax, that these happen in silos. So the question, I think, that we also throw back to ATAF and other organizations, how do we actually enhance the interinstitutional collaboration between the CFTA Secretariat, between the AU, between the ATAF, to ensure that the tax people and the investment people and the trade people that are bringing their different expertise are in the same room when these policies are being developed. Otherwise, the risk, Joy, you raised about dispute resolution is going to be a very serious issue, and Mary, you have emphasized that it's going to be a very serious issue, particularly when you consider the costs that are attached to it and the uneasiness that many of our government have in terms of going into those investor-state dispute resolution, which many end up ruling in favor of the private investors. I'll stop there first for my initial reactions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alvin. And we'll get to that question, but what I want to say is that in relation to what you concluded with, I think all the speakers yesterday had one thing to say, that this process is really in its nascent stage. And the African Union and the AfCFTA are working together on some of these issues as they rise. So some of the issues are emerging as the AfCFTA goes into implementation. So I think it's not a bad start. Even a conversation like this is a good one. And I was telling Madam Chinude yesterday that I learned so much from what she said when she was just doing her opening remarks. So I think as we go along, everybody's taking note and we'll handle that. John, your thoughts on this, and then I will pose my question to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Perhaps just briefly, the issue of fiscal sovereignty vis-a-vis the CFTA obligations. I think on one hand, we've learned that one of the good things that the CFTA is going to bring is the market access. And market access is a result of countries losing their sovereignty in terms of charging tariffs at the levels that they wish to do. So they have given up that sovereignty. And we now have the tariff regime being unified at lower levels. Now, when you look at the other obligations in terms of taxation, I think the question now is if we gave up sovereignty in terms of the tariff regime, we all want to benefit as Africans. Why can't we look at, giving up or making concession in terms of the sovereignty, in terms of the other aspects of revenue, which is taxation? So I think it's one of the issues that we are going to be discussing, and it's very key in terms of striking a balance between the trade issues or cross-border issues and the domestic issues when it comes to sovereignty and the CFTA requirements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Short and sweet. And I like that you're bringing us back to the conversation that the fact that when you agree to join a free trade area, then you're ceding some of that sovereignty. But at the same time, there are obligations that come along with it, and those obligations, again, have to be looked at in a uniformed way. What a nice way to conclude, that segment regarding domestic resource mobilization under the AfCFTA. I will now go to the second segment of our discussion, and this will be to you, John, on trade dispute mechanisms. And we have seen from what Joy presented and from the discussions even yesterday, that these disputes have wide implications for countries, not just financial, but also in terms of friendly relations to states. Some of them have been identified as a primary challenge in tax competition between the countries. The use of these incentives especially has been highlighted by every speaker. So considering the need to minimize these disputes on this and concerning taxation measures, how can state parties address the issue of competition? Number two, is a harmonized approach necessary? And what are the alternative tools that could be used, especially to attract this foreign direct investment, since we will have increased trade, especially intra-Africa trade? John will be our main discussant here, and the other panelists can please respond again, but I will ask that you keep your responses to a minimum so that we have some time for the Q&A. John.
Thank you very much. Again, let me put context into this. When we talk of state parties, we are basically referring to the CFTA members. Now, I think Joy has made a presentation which goes further afield, Europe, South America, and stuff. Those are within the WTO context. Now, just this particular emphasis that I want to make, that we are looking here at the CFTA where the 54 member countries, we are looking at the aspects of trade across the borders within the territory. We are also looking at tax issues by the same states or the same members. Now, again, the point that I just indicated to say, we have a mechanism where the tariff regime has been reduced with regards to goods and services. But now, we are looking at the aspect of taxation, which perhaps focuses on the direct taxes and some of the indirect taxes, but that are within the territories, which actually depend on the sovereignty of the countries in terms of them charging at whatever rate. And those may not ordinarily be covered by the tariff regime. Now, when you look at that context, you realize that we have the members that belong to the regional economic corporations, or RECs, and the certain RECs then are building blocks to the AfCFTA. Now, the point to make is, if we have the tax structures or tax regimes in the specific member countries, now we are looking at a situation where if we agreed as members of CFTA to give each other advantages. In other words, we keep talking about the loss of revenue, but I think at some point we have agreed that it's actually not a loss in the long term. We're giving each other market access. We used to block each other's goods, but we have opened up. That is to the advantage of everyone who's in the trade agreement. Now, what about the taxes? If we have the separate or different tax regimes that we have with myriad levels of tax incentives, who's the winner? We have given each other a cake by market access, by the reduction of tariff rates on one hand, and that is controlled. But what is it that we are trying to achieve on the taxation side? The tax incentives. Again, I keep drawing your attention back to the CFTA and not beyond the CFTA, because our focus is member countries who are supposed to benefit through the tax regimes. Remember, the investor that we are talking about is an investor from Kenya who wants to invest in South Africa, or vice versa. We are talking of an investor who may probably move capital between the countries. Now, there's that level. There's the level where we then say, outside the CFTA, there are those that originate their capital from the capital, headquarters, for example, where most of this capital can be sourced into various sectors of the economy, whether the extractive industry, whether it's manufacturing. Now, with regards to that, again, coming back to the point, if we have given each other market access for the advantages that accrue to that, and grow the market for everyone, and grow the economy, the aspect of tax incentives, the aspect of various concessions that we have in the market or in the economies, it does not accrue to us as Africans. If we look at the landscape of investment, most of the investments that we are looking at, that will actually even spare manufacturing within the territory. Some of it will come from outside. And now if you look at then giving away the tax incentives, the tax base is simply shifting from Africa, not to the member countries of the CFTA, but it will actually go outside the territory. So that's the context that I thought I should highlight at this point. And then to say, that said, as member countries, to answer the question, how can state parties address the issue of tax competition? We don't need to have the race to the bottom. We don't need to keep racing to the bottom, because it does not help us achieve the CFTA objectives. Because if we realize that most of the capital that will drive the manufacturing sectors, for example, as we still grow our economies, and we still receive most of the capital from the West, the base is shifting to the West. The tax base is shifting to the West. So in terms of then addressing the tax competition, it helps us as CFTA members if we identify that problem and say, we no longer have to have the race to the bottom. We just need to focus on, regulating minimum taxes, for example, or minimum tax ratios, for example. That we still have the sovereignty as member countries to make those adjustments. I think it's a matter of tax policy, if you look at it. And one thing to say is, we may be here as tax administrators, but key to the whole chain is, or rather to the whole dialogue, the treasuries or Ministry of Finance. I think for all of us, those are the key participants or key components of that formula. We also have the investment. I think if there is a disjoint between the investment arm of government, treasury, and of course tax administrators, that may create a challenge going forward. So number one, stop the race to the bottom. Number two, review, using the sovereignty powers, review the existing regime through the DTAs. I think with scope, also the review of the BITs, especially those tax aspects that still maintain the tax exemptions or incentives. And lastly, I think where we do have disputes that may arise, or potentially that may arise, I think there is need for conciliation, there is need for mediation and pursuance of exhaustion of domestic remedies. And these avoid the cost that comes with the disputes that may escalate to any body, like the scope or rather the nature of the DSB. And so as Africans, as members of CFTA, I think there is that scope that we still have the sovereign powers, just as we gave away the powers on the tariff regime, we still have the power to regulate or to move away from the race to the bottom. Now, in terms of whether harmonization is necessary, the answer is absolutely. We know that with 8 or so RECs in Africa, I think the key ones being SADC, COMESA, EAC, and ECOWAS, you will find there in that we have different bilateral investment treaties. And these are meant to sort of regulate. These are meant to harmonize. And the issue, though, is with those in place, have we had tremendous success in terms of harmonization? I think that's one key issue that we need to look at, that if we can measure the success or lack of at the regional economic community level of how the various treaties can or have managed to regulate or have managed to harmonize the taxes, that can give an indication of the efforts that we need at the CFTA level. Okay, so if we have not done much in terms of the regional economic communities, in terms of, for example, harmonizing the taxes to minimum levels, for example, what effort or what extra effort do we need at the continental level to achieve that? So it's very key for us to look at that at this point. And lastly, if we look at the alternative tools that are available to countries to encourage FDI and facilitate trade, I think we all know there are various factors that companies or investors, multinational companies, look at and focus on before they put investment. And in this case, we are also looking at African-grown investors. Remember, we are looking at the state parties. So those factors also remain. We have capital originating from within Africa, which is intra-Africa. We'll have that which will originate far afield, whether it's west. So you look at human capital investment, or rather human capital capacity development. That is very key. Instead of using the tax incentives or tax structures to attract investment, a well-trained human capital stock in a country, whether it's in ICT or any other sectors, specialized sectors, those are, that is one of the factors that we may need to focus, or member countries need to focus on. And the other one, of obviously, infrastructure development or improvement. The bad state of infrastructure in a country obviously discourages investment. How do we then attract investment other than the tax incentives or tax holidays? That is key. You can extend tax holidays, but if a company cannot have electricity when they set up, or they have electricity half the time, then they may change and go elsewhere. And of course, the aspect of political and government will and credibility, I think a few factors there to look at. Number one, government commitment to contracts. If a government or if governments renege on their commitments, investors will shun that economy or investing in that economy. So that's government credibility in terms of commitment is one other aspect that could also influence attraction of FDI, especially not just from Africa, but from beyond. Political stability, I think it goes without saying. Peaceful countries will always be desired by investors. And so rather than using the tax tool or regime as a tool, that is very key. Control of corruption, again, this is still under political and government credibility, where governments let it go or is business as usual when it comes to corruption or anti-corruption measures, then investors always shun that. But if government has measures in place or it takes its time to have presence and application of anti-corruption and anti-fraud legislation, it becomes attractive to FDI. Ease of doing business, again, that's another aspect where cross-border or even within the economies, it is very key. Regulations that affect key areas of business life, setting up a business, permits processing, electricity, registration of property, access to loans, and all those things. They do help. And these are key other than using the tax incentives, tax exemptions, and all that as a key attraction of investment. So, within the CFTA, in terms of going forward, perhaps not in the short term, in the long term, medium to long term, we are looking at the harmonization being key in terms of the taxation, and that to a greater extent will help us. But I think the lessons that we have learned from the regional economic communities should then help us to close the gaps that exist at the CFTA level. And lastly, I think the challenge is having ATAF working with AU. And this is one of the platforms that we actually have. With work being done between ATAF and other member states together with AU, I think it will go a long way in terms of guiding the way forward, in terms of charting the way forward and bringing all the expertise together, whether it's the tax people, the investment people, the trade people, and policymakers together. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, John. And in a nutshell, avoid race to the bottom. Harmonization is necessary. I like that you say that the lessons learned from the regs could be adopted in the AfCFTA. Therefore, no need to really reinvent the wheel there. And then you talked about the key areas regarding the tools that could be used. In the interest of time, I'm not going to ask the other panelists to respond to that because I feel John has really done justice to that. But I will go straight to Alvin so that we can then have some time also for the Q&A. And Alvin is going to be talking about cooperation to combat illicit financial flows because, like, again, Joy said, this is going to be an opportunity for people who have ill intentions to try and exploit whatever gaps may exist. So Alvin, in terms of what Joy said, what IFF-related vulnerabilities does the FTA bring, and how can this be curbed? Africa has the potential to also attract fraud, especially in this new arrangement under the AfCFTA. What could be done in terms of that? How can the elimination of NTBs also add to that fight? Over to you, Alvin.
Thanks, Marian. Since I already have the floor, I will still react, just make one small point to John's presentation. I know it will steal 1 minute from my own presentation, but I think it's really important. I think generally there is need to strike the balance between policy certainty and policy flexibility, because I think many times these conversations are seen as the extremes of each other. The investors want certainty and the government wants flexibility. And the answer lies somewhere in the middle, because on one side, you want to avoid a situation where like the investors are making long-term investments and want to avoid a situation of erratic policy shifts on the government, so they really insist on in the case of Zambia, for example, we saw the whole agenda around the stabilization clauses, but on the other side, governments want the flexibility to be able to react either in the tax arena or in the investment arena, also in the trade arena, wants to be able to react to the changing economic fundamentals, economic parameters. So I think in that regard, really a conversation on how do we strike that balance that avoids us straitjacketing governments into very long-term agreements that undermine the whole economic development agenda is an important conversation to have. So I'll make three very short interventions because I'm conscious of time, so that we can go into discussion. One, I think that when we look at the areas of vulnerability, particularly when it comes to the IFF conversation, and building up from what Joy was saying, I see three key areas that, and I think some of those came up in Joy's presentation. One, I think that the continent, largely both across the areas of investment, trade, tax, is characterized by rather weak regulatory framework. Many of our laws are outdated. We look at one of the side conversation yesterday, we were discussing the question of the double tax agreement, some of them that were signed post-independence that are also being applicable until today. So there are serious policy gaps that I think need to be revisited to ensure that as we move to this new kind of trade dispensation under the CFTA, we are revisiting those laws and ensuring that they are keeping in time, they are updated in time. Particularly if you look at these whole nascent digital economic conversations, the fintech that was being mentioned, how our regulatory framework is responsive to those kind of things is important. The second, and I think Joy mentioned this, is the institutions, the coordination among institutions, both at the national level and at regional level. The collaboration and either interdepartmental or interinstitutional collaboration, I think, presents a huge gap that provides opportunities for risks of illicit financial flows. The third area, I think, is, in my own assessment, a significant knowledge gap that I think, and the conversation in the ATRN, I think, is very timely because even when you look at the question of illicit financial flows and in terms of how broad it is, becomes difficult to say, okay, are we talking about, because the whole definition of illicit financial flows cuts across corruption, crime, money laundering, cuts across tax-related illicit financial flows. So when we talk of that nexus between illicit financial flows and the CFTA, that there is need to invest more in research to unpack that and draw very concise and direct policy recommendations that are related to the different elements of the illicit financial flows. And I'm happy to note, for example, the colleagues from UNCTAD are trying to invest in this work of actually trying to develop country-specific data when it comes to the concept of illicit financial flows and contextualizing it to country-specific experiences. The second point I would like to make when it comes to the curbing of potential cross-border fraud and tax avoidance, really I think the most important investment that can be done is investing in institutional framework that facilitate the exchange of information among countries. And how illicit financial flows happens in an environment of opacity. And if governments in the different areas don't know what the companies in the different jurisdictions are doing, the ability to control even the financial reports that are being presented presents a huge challenge and also incentivizes the illicit financial flow. So really investing in developing continental frameworks that allow the exchange of information is really important, and if creating even portals that allow the easy access of this information, even not just for tax purposes, but even from experience sharing, from peer learning, and so forth. And the second point on this issue is really the investment on digitalization. I think we heard this yesterday. Digitalization can help in terms of leapfrogging and addressing some of the policy gaps that we see. And lastly, and we have seen this again in some of the recs, the establishment of the one-stop shops in terms of cross-border collaboration, having at the border one-stop that addresses the customs across different, and building and investing in both technical and human resource capacity in tax administration. And the last point, intervention I'd like to make is around the link between the CFTA and the IFF. And as I noted earlier, I think that the AU strategy, the AU tax and IFF strategy clearly acknowledges this nexus between the CFTA and domestic resource mobilization and the risk that is posed by issues such as the harmful tax competition that has been, I think, a constant feature in this conversation. The question of how we take this forward is really to get both the tax people into the trade conversation and the trade people into the tax conversations. That, I think, will be a significant, how we build these bridges between the two processes that are currently running more in parallel, I think is gonna be important. And I mentioned earlier that if you look at the CFTA, the referencing, and Joy mentioned this, the referencing around the work of that has been done with the Mbeki port process, the work that Ungutat has done, I think presents a missed opportunity. And finally, I think spaces like this that ATRN has created for knowledge generation, for investment into more research, provides a significant opportunity, in my sense, in terms of how do we generate country-specific and issue-specific knowledges that can contribute to development of adapted policies that also address the point I raised earlier about the gaps in the policy arena. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alvin. And in a nutshell, you're saying that knowledge is power. Let's invest in knowledge so that we understand the implications of this AfCFTA, and not just on the tariff revenue, but on the other areas as well, especially on the regulatory framework. And I totally agree, because that is an area that clearly has serious gaps, like Joy indicated in her presentation. But Rosamond had also asked to say a few things, especially regarding what could be done on taxation and IFFs, and I'll give her the floor so that she can use the next few minutes as you organize your thoughts. And I'll be taking 3 questions at first. Colleagues, if you can check for me who's online and would like to speak, I would also be very appreciative so that we manage our time well. Rosamond?
Thank you very much, Mary. So looking at IFFs and trade facilitation, as well as capacities of our tax and customs officers, I think that capacity development is very germane when it comes to trade facilitation. So we cannot implement trade facilitation without building the capacities of our customs and tax officers, because by extension, the trade facilitation looks at reducing the transaction costs at the interface of businesses and governments. And I see the tax and customs officers being at that interface. So if they are to support the businesses, then it means that they really need to understand the provisions and the trade facilitation, analyze it so that they can apply it to support the businesses. And relating it to illicit financial flows, I think that there are certain key issues in the AfCFTA that we really need to build capacities of our tax and customs administrations on. And looking at rules of origin, which is very, very key. There are certain criteria that defines the origin of a particular product. So if you don't meet the criteria, you don't benefit. It's important that our customs officers are upbeat about these criteria to ensure that people who don't really comply or meet the set criteria are not granted the preferential treatment. So that is very important. Another issue that we also need to look at is the issue of mutual assistance and cooperation between customs administrations as well as tax administrations. It's important that we share information, because if you talk about cross-border trade, it means I'm moving from Ghana to Kenya to trade. And if I'm not communicating with the person, the tax administration or customs administration in Kenya, there could be certain information that could be relevant to me in Ghana, which will be in Kenya, but I may not have access to. So customs, mutual assistance and customs cooperation is important, as well as exchange of information for tax administrations. We need to build capacities. Even with the exchange of information, is it on request or automatic? How do I request? When I receive the request, how do I respond? Even when I get information, how do I use the information? These are critical areas that we really need to build the capacities on. And not to forget transfer pricing, very critical when it comes to cross-border trading. We also need to reinforce our policies and trainings when it comes to transfer pricing and all these BEPS issues and the international topical issues that are currently being discussed. And when it comes to the various agencies in the area of investment and trade and revenue, I think Joy indicated it. We need to collaborate and coordinate. We need to share information. Sometimes it's as if they are into some sort of competition. If you request for information, they are not ready even to release that information. We need to go beyond that. Perhaps we even need to look at the various mandates that sets up these institutions. Perhaps there are certain provisions that prohibits them from sharing certain information. So we really need to maybe take stock of the regulatory frameworks of these institutions to ensure that we simplify the processes. When it's complicated, people will find avenues to abuse the system. So let's simplify our processes and avoid duplication and work as a team, because we are all working towards the same goal. Looking at the AfCFTA, it's already in the framework and the various protocols that they are going to support capacity development of tax and customs, of customs officers, yes. But specifically, we don't know how they are going to do it. And I think that they need to come up with a training strategy, capacity development strategy, with an action plan at the continental level. And then also ensure that maybe the action plan is also deployed at the national level, so that there could also be monitoring. Whatever we have agreed to do in terms of the strategy, we make sure that it is done. And finally, talking about training, one thing I have realized that the issues are very dynamic and very evolving. So maybe a one-off training may not work. We need to have constant trainings. And one challenge is that we sometimes have high staff turnover in our institutions, sometimes due to natural attrition, and other times to internal transfers. So you may train somebody today, the next moment the person will not be on that seat. So it means that we need to do a lot more training. Let's move us from maybe having one focal point, but try to reach out to as many people as possible. If resources will not permit us to move from a focal point, then we need to ensure that our strategy ensures that after the training, this focal point would go back to their jurisdictions and also organize workshops and training so that we can have the multiplier effect. And there should be a system to really follow up on these issues so that we don't lose out on the trainings that we have undertaken. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rosemont. And indeed, simplification is better, as she says, because that will help everybody to do their job, from a point of knowledge, and therefore limit these IFFs. Number two, interagency cooperation, and more interagency cooperation. So I'm now opening the floor for the first 3 questions. And if there's anything online, colleagues, please let me know. I see my colleague, Joe, is looking at me. I think he's telling me that I'm 10 minutes late.
Just to acknowledge the presence of the Commissioner General of the Ghana Revenue Authority, Reverend Dr. Amishadai Ouswamwa. Shall we give him a hand? Welcome, Commissioner General.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe, and welcome, sir. And this morning we're looking at taxation and illicit financial flows, and under the ACFTA, we're just done with the panel discussion, and we're going into our question and answer session. Please remember that you can pose the questions to Joy, who made the presentation, as well as to the panelists. I welcome the first 3 comments. I can't see properly because of the light, so the colleagues who are around can help me identify if there are any hands. Right?
Yeah, so
I see my sister from Uncle will take Joseph, and from this side, and then these, the 2 hands here, and then we'll start. Okay. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My question, thanks again for the presentation and the speakers. My question will go to Joy. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was interesting to see the different provisions under both GATT, the MFN and NT, and also how that can be applied under the CFTA. But my question to you would be, what happened during COVID? We know that there were a lot of policy measures that were put in place to kind of enable some of the industries and sectors to kind of recover from the impact of COVID and how to revive the economy. So I'm sure some of those provisions must have been violated, and because of first measure, maybe they were not dispute that arise after that one. But then wouldn't country be able now to say, okay, I can use any force measure even at a domestic level to kind of protect my own industries and kind of put in place some of those tax incentives or other measures to kind of revive a little bit or maybe give a kind of boost to my domestic economy? Is that something that they can use again, or because it was just a global pandemic, they were given some type of waivers? Thank you.
Thanks, Habiba. Robert?
Hello. Good morning. Well, my concerns is about communication and re-emphasizing what Madam said. Right in this room, you can realize when the translator is not around yesterday, what we went through. And I'm sure maybe certain officials will be drawing back when it comes to language, not necessarily because they would not want to communicate with you, but because of language alone, they might be running away. So the systems should be in place, and we should make sure that at every point, the officers in place are able to communicate in the various languages. Now, my final point is about the issue of fronting. We've met here to do this for Africa. This is for Africans. But unfortunately, most at times, there are Africans among us who decide to front for other Europeans. And so you see a company that will be trading amongst us here, but not belonging to Africans. So we should make our systems sharp enough to detect that these companies that are operating within the sub-regions are indeed for Africans, so that what we have planned here for Africans should benefit Africans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, point well taken. Now I'll ask Robert, please.
I hope the microphone is now on. Thank you very much. And thanks, Joy, for bringing that very exciting discussion between tax, investment, and trade. I will address my questions on 3 issues. One is to do with the trade dispute settlement mechanism. We all know that we are building the African Continental Free Trade Area premised on the existing regional economic communities, which are all at different levels of integration. And I'll give the example of the East African community, which has the East African Court of Justice. This is a typically different form of judicial system when you compare it to ECOWAS and the rest of the countries. But it's already overwhelmed by other issues because the treaty established in the East African community goes beyond trade issues. It talks about peace and security, regional cooperation, and the rest. when we're talking about harmonization, how shall we address such different judicial systems to have a harmonized system of addressing disputes at the African continent? The second issue is to do with the export levies. I think Alvin has hinted on it. We are trying to promote even intra-Africa investments, but majority of our countries are already signatories to the EU economic partnership agreements, which are against increases in export levies. Isn't this a risk to African countries to remain producing raw materials and have no incentives for value addition so that they can trade amongst themselves? And lastly, the idea of bilateral investment treaties. You notice that majority of African countries, if Joy could give us the statistics, our countries have more bilateral investment treaties with non-African countries as compared to fellow African countries. So it means even with the opening up of the Continental Free Trade Area, if the investment treaties remain as they are and are not revised or considered, they will still be favoring non-African investors, which is a matter of concern. And finally, to ATAF, I think there is, even when we think about capacity building, we should consider capacity building for who? I think even the matter of creating awareness alone, that these matters are related, is important. Because people who are handling tax think tax is alone, those who are handling investment think investment is alone, and those who are handling trade are thinking that trade is alone. We saw it in the COVID with the virus appetite and the rest. The tax people are not very concerned, the trade people are at the other side, and there was an issue of intellectual property under trade. So I think we should also get general awareness before we even think of the technical capacity. I submit.
Thank you so much, Robert. I will take the two hands on this row, my sister, and then the last question, and then we will respond. Not for now, please.
Thank you, Chair. Though I did not raise my hand, but I can comment on issues of racing to the bottom in terms of investment. I think this matter is really so much of concern in that we do have different capacities, and I think because of that, member states would want to pull this investment, and the tool that we're trying to use as member states could be this tax incentive. And I think something ought to be done to just ensure that the matters that were raised from the panel there on trying to deal with the cases that are causing probably these member states to have disadvantages dealt with. Among other issues would be the matter of infrastructure. How do we deal with issues of infrastructure as member states? Could we then be having maybe funds to ensure that matters of infrastructure are dealt with? Because this is one of the key issues that may be disadvantaging some member states and are causing them to rush to the bottom by issuing incentives. I submit, Chair.
Thank you very much. Is your microphone now okay?
Now it's working.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. My question goes to Joy. Thank you very much for the insightful discussion on trade-based money laundering. You did indeed point out that maybe we should take the direction of ECOWAS and GIABA. And I noted that under FATF, the members are GIABA, the East African countries, Central African countries, Western African countries. So it appears that as African countries, we are already represented under FATF through different regional blocks. Do you propose that we do away with these regional blocks like GIABA and the East African groups and then just become as an African Continental Free Trade Area as a member of FATF? Or do we maintain the regional blocks because as it appears we are already members of FATF? That's the first question. The second question was in regards to subsidies. the subsidies in Africa mostly are in regards to agriculture, and agriculture subsidies are allowed under the WTO. In your opinion, is it going to be a problem in terms of subsidies in Africa, since most of the things that we do subsidize are in regards to agriculture products? And the examples that you gave in regards to we're going to fall prey to WTO agreements, is it really going to affect us as African countries, or we are going to use the agriculture subsidies or the other developing countries' exceptions, or is this really going to affect us as African countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now respond to those questions, and then I will take the question at the back later and respond to online questions. Joy? So, Joy, you respond to the questions that were raised to you.
Okay.
Alvin will respond to the question on the different capabilities. John will respond to the issues to do with the race to the bottom, and then we'll take the next batch.
Okay. I'll begin with Habiba's question. Regarding the protection of industries and, you know, how you're supposed to transition into this process, right? And I think I think you raised an important question, because it's the strategy that countries need to take, really. That's what we need to focus on. And I think we have a period of time to adjust, but we don't have as much time as the European Union, for example, where they were in a very different economic time, but also they held different types of power. So there were different statuses between these two regional blocks. So what we do need to do is probably a stage for evaluation of where do we stand and what actions need to be taken immediately. But in terms of protection of the industries, I mean, special and differential treatment is a very important concept within the AfCFTA for the least developing countries. But I do anticipate that it will be a challenge, right? So we want to have phased processes for the countries that are least developed. But the problem at the WTO is that we as African countries are all special and differential treatment entitled. So how do we distinguish ourselves from one another will be the first challenge. Two is, how long do you actually want to receive special and differential treatment? Because it's been a crisis in the WTO that some continue to receive. So if our larger economies continue to benefit from this, and the smaller economies are also kind of fighting against each other, then how do we prioritize whose needs are more important and how long those needs need to be prioritized? So I think you raise a good question about strategy. So first is this is why the action needs to be immediate before the implementation has already begun. We can anticipate some of the problems based on other frameworks. We can already begin to prepare ourselves for the responses. And I think it's important for us to be aware that we have a huge task ahead, because some of us are still manual, others are technology. I hear blockchain is being discussed in some forums. Others, it's still about how do we get our paperwork back into data and technology usage. So we need to start asking ourselves, what's the benchmark for us to be prepared to respond to these future issues? So really, it's a strategy question, but it's a very important question. I like the point about communication and the various languages, because interpretation is also affected by language. And indeed, when interpreting the trade obligations, actually, it's a big issue in DTAs alone, that if you use French, does it translate to the same meaning? And will countries have the same understanding? Same with the CFTA, and same with the tax issues that we will face in the future. There's a paper that was written about trade deflection, which is this issue of non-CFTA originating goods. And there's a gentleman there who can probably talk about this issue and how we need to respond to the potential for non-CFTA originating goods. Robert, your question on dispute settlement mechanisms. I think it's good to distinguish what the EACJ is doing, because EACJ is dealing beyond trade, but it means that we have to ask ourselves, what level of sovereignty are we committed to giving up? So right now we've said trade liberalization. Next, we have to say our human rights issues become a continental issue, right? Then we say other aspects of the system need to become continental issues, because if, for example, we say money laundering needs to be a harmonized approach,
If one country does not follow the rules, where do you challenge it? Where do you contest it? And how do you enforce the challenge that has been raised, right? So the EU is, of course, the example of like that deepened integration and the willingness to give up the sovereignty. But are we willing to do that? I will leave it to countries to decide how much you want to give up. Managing the obligations towards other frameworks, right? So a lot of countries have signed trade protocols or trade agreements. We saw Kenya doing the US. We've seen the EU agreements that single countries have, and that's a conversation about harmonization. To be quite honest, do we want a singular approach or do we want to continue the unilateral approaches? I think my presentation has already shown that unilateral approaches are dangerous. We will be competing with one another. We will not be resolving the problems that joint prosperity is supposed to resolve. The final question that was about ECOWAS, GIABA, and the fact that countries are members of FATF. My point is not about membership in FATF. My point is, yes, GIABA, ISAMLAG, and the Southern African one exist. However, different countries are at different levels. Just as with industrialization, our regulatory frameworks are at different levels. And FATF continue to recognize this. If you look at transparency, for example, a lot of countries are still struggling simply with the beneficial ownership transparency regimes, right? But we have countries within Africa that have great case studies. South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, indeed, also has a really great example of implementing beneficial ownership transparency. The question is not membership. The question is implementation and progress towards implementation, shared progress towards implementation. So not that we should all be members or joint members. Membership should continue as individual countries because we have to report individually. What we need is now a joint stance on where should we be 5 years from now on our AML frameworks. Where should implementation be? Where should the practices be? What extent should we be cooperating between our authorities? Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. I think you guys will have to bear with me because there's an online question to you that says, thank you for the presentation and the vibrant discussions. The referenced examples of disputes refers. The EU has recently warned that South Africa's scrap export ban may contravene WTO obligations. What balance can be attained in such situations under the AfCFTA where a country aims to deal with theft or even IFFs? And the question is from Mrs. Ntabiseng Dibeila.
That's a really good question because one thing we need to address is future challenges to individual countries through other regional frameworks or through the global WTO framework. And this is what South Africa is now facing. And the question is, do we have the shared capacities to support us to comply with the external obligations that we will also have as countries? I think it's complicated because even as we begin to comply with the CFTA requirements, we will still need to ensure that we are continuing our external obligations. And it leaves maybe a very big task for the CFTA Secretariat and for ATAF to actually harmonize our processes and make sure that the minimum benchmark is actually the external compliance with the external requirements as well. But indeed, for South Africa, I think it's the question of support to comply and ensure that they're not violating the trade obligations externally. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Joy. I'll go to Alvin to answer his question, and then John, and then Prof, if you can prepare yourself for a question that says, I'm glad you brought up the issue of money laundering when addressing illicit financial flows. We can't ignore trade-based money laundering when discussing cross-border trade. What is your take? I'll come back to you after Alvin.
Yeah, very brief. I think Joy did speak to the question that was raised about the different capabilities of different countries. So I will not repeat that. I think I would like to raise two responses. I think that the circumstance that many of our African countries find themselves is what has often been referred to as the spaghetti ball effect, where you have different countries being membership to different bodies and signing agreements that are often competing or contradictory. and almost impossible to administer and are very resource intense to administer. So how we create policy coherence between that, I think, is one of the biggest challenge. I was in my past life involved in the kind of trade conversations, and where the conversation, Robert, you raised about the economic partnership agreement, huge contestation between both the East African countries as a regional body, but also individual countries. Kenya going ahead and signing, although it was supposed to be an agreement that is signed at sub-regional level. The implications of this vis-a-vis a continental free trade agreement, I think, opens a can of worms that needs to be unpacked. How we disentangle these various agreements that cut across tax, investment, and trade, and ensure that there's coherence. I think I don't have an answer to that, but it's probably a subject for another conference in terms of what that means. The other thing I would like to raise in regard to the question that was raised is really, while of course the ambition of the CFTA is to create a common market for the continent, is the distinctions that needs to be made between not just smaller states and bigger states, or between fragile states and stronger states. We have seen, for example, in the case of the East Africa, the impact we have seen of money laundering, of smuggling from DRC, from Somalia, presenting really significant challenge. And then you have, of course, countries in the region that tax havens, including Mauritius, or aspiring to be tax havens by setting up countries such as Rwanda, and I hope I'm not stepping on toes here, Kenya, that are setting up international financial centers that are poorly regulated, that will have significant implications when it comes to the financial regulation, even within the context of the CFTA. So I think this is just throwing the spanner into the works that even as we consider the different circumstances or the different uniqueness of the different countries, there are different dimensions we can look at that. What does the role does Mauritius play when it has basically positioned itself as the entry point for investment into the continent and has structured its financial system to facilitate that? What does that mean when it comes to the context of the CFTA, when China signs an agreement with Mauritius, basically opening up a floodgate for the flooding of goods and services from China? I think there is really a more kind of conversation we need to have that tries to unpack some of these complexities within the CFTA.
And John?
Thanks. Thanks very much. And Madam, you raised the issue of the race to the bottom vis-a-vis, I'll call them vulnerable states. Perhaps more may be derogatory. Vulnerable states in the context of the bid to attract FDI. Now, I think it goes without saying that north, south, east, west of Africa, which makes the whole continent, we have different political backgrounds, colonial backgrounds, and the rest of it. And pretty much that determines the levels of our economies to some extent, if not to a greater extent. Whether it's by the political colonial ties that we have to our former masters, who may be influential in what it is that drives the economy or slows it down. Now, that's reality on the ground. Now, the question is, do we have mechanisms in the region or in Africa, in various regions, that have tried to assist vulnerable states to move from the level that they are in terms of poor infrastructure, for example? The answer is yes. How has that been done? I think I'll talk about SADC, for example. I think it also applies to EAC and perhaps ECOWAS. You have therein guidelines that say so much of the government budget should be spent on capital investment, on infrastructure investment, rather. That on its own is an effort at the regional economic community level to give guidelines that may not be, that may be auxiliary to the encouragement or the promotion of investment in the region. Actually, it looks at or focuses on the local investment into infrastructure. That's public spending. That is envisaged to then help attraction of the foreign investment. So I think the effort is already there in place by the countries, by the regions, to try and spur investment in infrastructure. The question is, to what extent? I think Pan-Africanism in this case is what comes into mind, and it invokes emotions from people like Thomas Sankara. What is it that we can do for ourselves without having to wait for someone to do it for us? So that's the thinking. Vulnerability, yes, is there, it's accepted, but do we have a way out? The answer is yes. We are resource-rich as Africa. Most of our countries here, we have resources, extractives. So it's then to put our minds together to say, those that are lagging behind, with what we already have in place, the mechanism, frameworks, guidelines in terms of investment in infrastructure, how can we perhaps substantiate, or rather supplement that, perhaps at the continental level. But suffice to say, it's reality, but we need to move out of there to improve our own local infrastructure, because the resources are there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. There was a question at the back next to Susan. She stepped out, so we're lucky. But Professor, somebody had talked about money laundering online, and they were happy that we were having that discussion. And the question goes, well, the statement goes that I'm glad you brought about the issue of money laundering when addressing illicit financial flows. We can't ignore trade-based money laundering when discussing this cross-border, during discussing this and cross-border trade. What is your take, Professor Mehdi? And then we will conclude. Professor Mehdi.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je voudrais simplement dire que, en fait, de blanchiment d'argent et de transfert illicite de fonds, les mécanismes qui sont en cause sont des mécanismes informels. C'est des mécanismes informels. La loi existe, les tests existent, mais c'est le contournement des tests qui est en cause. Et je donne un exemple assez simple en termes de transfert illicite. En 2004, je suis originaire du Bénin. En 2004, il y a eu un accident d'avion à Cotonou. Un avion, ce n'est pas une compagnie habituelle comme on connaît là, ce n'est pas les compagnies aériennes qu'on connaît, mais c'est un avion affrété par, je crois, la communauté libanaise de Cotonou. L'avion venait de Conakry et a atterri à Cotonou, et c'était un 24 décembre en plus, la veille de Noël. Et l'avion devait continuer son parcours vers Beyrouth. Alors, l'avion décolle de Cotonou, enfin décolle de l'aéroport de Cotonou. À peine décollé, ça retombe dans la mer, au large de Cotonou. Bon, pas au large de Cotonou, mais sur la plage de Cotonou. Évidemment, sur la plage de Cotonou, il y a des pêcheurs. Et les pêcheurs ont vu un engin tomber dans l'eau et ils ont vu au loin des gens sortir de l'avion, essayer de se sauver, etc., etc. Donc les pêcheurs de Cotonou se sont afflués vers l'épave de l'avion. Ils ont sorti quelques, j'allais dire passagers, ils les ont ramenés sur la rive, sur la plage. Et évidemment, le passager plus ou moins en vie veut le ranimer, donc il enlève sa veste. Il enlève la veste au passager et il se rend compte qu'à l'intérieur de la veste, il y avait des dollars, beaucoup de dollars. Alors, le premier pêcheur qui a fait l'expérience, il dit aux autres, les passagers que nous sommes en train de sauver, dans leur poche, il y a beaucoup d'argent. Alors, tous les pêcheurs qui sont sur la rive, chacun est allé chercher son Libanais, il l'a ramené sur la plage, il l'a dépouillé et ils ont laissé les corps là, ils sont fuis, ils sont partis. La police, les sapeurs-pompiers sont arrivés après, ils ont récupéré les corps qui restaient, mais ils n'ont pas trouvé les costumes, les vestes, etc. Bien, cet argent a été collecté évidemment à Conakry et également à Cotonou, j'imagine, peut-être dans l'ensemble de la sous-région. Et les gens repartaient au Liban avec. Évidemment, en violation de la réglementation en vigueur sur les transferts d'argent. Ceci pour dire simplement que la question de la lutte contre les trafics illicites, le commerce illicite d'argent, c'est plus une question d'application de la loi, de méthode dans l'application de la loi, qu'une question d'édiction de la loi, d'édiction de nouveaux tests. Car la réglementation est là, elle est garantie par la BCEAO, en tout cas pour ce qui concerne les pays membres de l'UEMOA.
Member countries have their laws concerning international money transfers.
Mas as
But then
pessoas
people
procuram
find ways
como
of
livrar
bypassing these laws and
para
then
poder usar dinheiro de forma
their
ilegal,
monies in
violando estas
breach of
regras.
these regulations.
Si c'était réellement licite,
And so,
A transferência ilícita
if
não seguem os canais normais.
normal channels are followed in transferring money, then we wouldn't be talking about illicit financial flows. And so the stakeholders, I mean, need to pay attention. This is what I have to say about the question asked. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You had wanted to say something in relation to what was discussed.
So just to add to what John said, with regards to the struggling economies who will not be able to meet the AfCFTA commitments, I recall that yesterday I posed the same question to Mr. Befi, and Mr. Befi confirmed that there's a facility at Afrexim Bank that the economies can apply to for support. So I think that if Mr. Befi is around, you can have a bilateral discussion with him, and then we see how best this can be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you so much for keeping it short. And I really want to conclude by thanking Joy and the panelists, Professor Mehdi, Madam Roslyn, Alvin, and John, for the very excellent way that you have really raised some of these issues and helped us to understand them better, but also to thank you, the participants. And there are about 4 things that we have looked at in this, that the loss of tariff revenue is not the only concern for countries, and therefore there's a lot more to look at, especially in understanding the impact of trade provisions and the investment protocol, that issues of dispute may arise, so countries need to prepare for that, but most importantly, they need to stop the reasons why those disputes may arise, like providing wasteful tax incentives, providing unfair treatment to the different members of the AfCFTA, and of course to say that, yes, sovereignty is certain and it determines how we determine this policy, but we work in an environment that is regulated, so it is important to also have this regulation. And of course, the different speakers spoke about the issue of human capacity, the issue of and its development for the proper running of the AfCFTA, the issue of improving our regulatory framework, the issue of digitization, and of course, what we all looked at as interagency cooperation. So I want to thank you all, and I want to say that this conversation continues even, tomorrow and later in the different groups. But I also want to say that it is clear that everybody around the table has so much to say about this. It's unfortunate we lost some time at the beginning and we couldn't take more questions. But I want to say that it is a conversation that continues, and all the players here understand that it will be a joint effort for us to build the capacity that is required to make the AfCFTA work. So thank you so much, and may God truly bless you.
Let's do it better. Yeah, distinguished participants, you agree with me that the session has been what I would describe as an epitome of knowledge impartation, a perfect example of knowledge impartation in the areas of trade, investment, capacity building, continental coordination, and the likes. Let's give it up to them once again. Yes, just to inform us all that this session is being streamed live on social media handles, Facebook, YouTube, at Ghana Revenue. And then updates are on LinkedIn, as well as LinkedIn and Twitter. So kindly get colleagues, friends, office colleagues connected so that they can join the discussion. Now, a couple of announcements on the next session. We're going to have a breakout session. Room 1 will be on the topic. Room 1 is on the paper, African Continental Free Trade Area, Multilateral Tax Dispute Court, a proposal for timely resolution of commercial tax dispute within AfCFTA. And there will be 3 presenters there, and then there will be a Q&A session, question and answers. And then room 2 will be on corporate criminal liability and tax evasion. How can Malawi deal with professional enablers of tax evasion? Of course, 3 presentations as well. The second presentation will be free trade and tax efficiency, and then the third, fiscal policy, corruption and poverty in WAMU. Then the third room will have a presentation on technology evolution, designing tax policies, and how to travel by road and by rail under SA, that is SA VAT. South African VAT, SA VAT. How to travel by road and rail, be treated, okay, we'll get the topic corrected. Right. So, this is what we're going to do. In order to save time, we are urging all of us to grab our tea, coffee, or snack and go into an appropriate meeting room. But then tea is served for room 1 just when you go through the door. Tea is served for room 1 there. Room 2 and 3 will have their snack and tea within. So just pick it and then get to your seat. Then we have the breakout session so that we can save some time. I've been informed that we have a lot within the day. There's gala night at 6 o'clock as well. So let's do our best to save some time so that we can enjoy all the program. Thank you very much for your active participation. Yes. Hello, distinguished participants, just for emphasis, we have T7, room 2 and 3, meeting rooms 2 and 3. Meeting room 1, which is where we are, T is just outdoor. The moment you step out of the door, tea and your snacks are there. Just grab and come in so that we save some time. Thank you very much.
Yes, I know. I was in touch.